Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel for another midweek mystery video. Today we're going to be covering the case of Emanuela Orlandi, a name you might have heard but a story you might not know. She mysteriously disappeared from Vatican City on the 22nd of June 1983, and whilst there have been many potential leads over the years, none of them have ever led anywhere. This is a case full of conspiracies and theories and scandals, many of them involving the Catholic Church. It's coming up to 37 years since her disappearance and we're still no closer to an answer. Emanuela Orlandi was born 14th of January 1968, the fourth of 5 children to Ercole and Maria Orlandi. There were 4 girls and 1 boy. The family lived inside Vatican City, which is the world's smallest country, an independent city-state that covers just over 100 acres within Italy, just outside of Rome. It has its own euros, own stamps, licence plates and passports. As of 2017, it's estimated to have a population of about 1,000 people and is ruled by the Pope, the head of the Catholic Church. Ercole Orlandi, Emanuela's dad, worked in Vatican City, and although reports differ on what his job was, HuffPost Italy writes that he worked at the Vatican Prefecture and dealt with papal audiences, although other sources state that he worked in the Vatican Bank. Regardless, he was a rather senior official within Vatican City. The family lived together in a flat inside the walls of the Vatican City, and for all intents and purposes, it seemed like they were a pretty happy family. The children had the run of the Vatican Gardens. It was such a small population, there weren't many of them there. Emanuela's brother, Pietro Orlandi, says, "The Vatican Gardens were available to us as if it was our own back garden. We felt we were in the safest place in the world." But this story takes place in June 1983. Emanuela was 15 years old and had just finished her 2nd year of high school at the Liceo Scientifico in Rome, but was actually continuing to take music lessons throughout the summer. She was a really talented musician. She played the piano, she sang in the choir and played the flute. She took 3 flute lessons a week at the Tommaso Ludovico de Victoria School, located in Rome about a mile away from her home. To get to her music lessons, she would have had to have taken the number 64 bus, a journey she obviously took multiple times a week by herself. She would get on the bus near her home and take it just a few stops before getting off and walking about 200 metres from the bus stop to her music school. Only on June 22nd, 1983, Emanuela goes to her music lesson. She leaves her family home carrying her flute. Emanuela and her brother Pietro actually had a row before she left home that day. Emanuela had asked him to escort her on the bus journey, but he'd said no, and so she left, slamming the door, and that's the last time he ever saw her. He says that he's never forgiven himself for this. She arrived at her music lesson late that day, and according to her teacher, she seemed very distracted the entire time, and she actually asked to leave 10 minutes early at 6:50 p.m, which she did. But Emanuela didn't head straight home after this. Her friends actually saw her as they got on the bus speaking to a red-haired woman. It's worth saying that whilst there is a fair amount of coverage on this case in English, of course this happened in Italy and therefore the original coverage of the case is all in Italian, which leads to small details getting a little bit lost in translation along the way. But I will do my best to provide complete transparency where I can. I'm just aware that some things are a little bit confusing in this and I've tried to piece it all together. Not long after she was last seen by her friends, she calls home and speaks to her sister Federica, where she explains why she'd been late to her music lesson that day. Emanuela said that she'd been stopped by a man in a green BMW on the street just in front of the Italian Senate, who offered her money, about 375 lira, to sell Avon cosmetics. A traffic officer and a police officer both witnessed Emanuela talking to this man. But it just so happened, of course, that the building's cameras weren't working that day. She tells Federica that this man had offered to pay her to distribute pamphlets for Avon products at a 2-hour fashion show event that weekend, and that she told him that she'd have to check with her parents first. That's why she was calling home. But Federica answers and tells her that her parents aren't there, but still suggests that Emanuela talks it through with them before she commits to the job. Now, Emanuela actually had plans to go and meet another sister in a nearby piazza at 7:30 p.m, but she never turns up. She's just disappeared. Allegedly, she was last seen getting into a large, dark-coloured BMW, possibly the same BMW from which the man had approached her about Avon. She didn't come home that night though, and her mother has described it as the worst night of her life. They soon report Emanuela as missing to the police, who at first suggested that she may have just been with a friend and would return soon, but her family knew that this wasn't the case. As her brother Pietro was quoted as saying in The Guardian, "She was so serene, she had something planned with her sister and had music recitals a few days later. It just wasn't like Emanuela to do something like this. She wouldn't just disappear." They knew that she'd either been involved in an accident or abducted. And so the next day, Thursday the 23rd of June, her parents called the director of the music school to ask if Emanuela's friends or classmates knew anything. Her parents started the detective work themselves, but luckily the police didn't need too much convincing that Emanuela was missing. And that very same day, the Thursday, she's officially declared a missing person and an investigation begins. Over the next couple of days, information about the disappearance leaks to the media, and announcements were published in Italian newspapers, both national and local. Along with news of the disappearance, the police also provided them with the phone number of the Orlandi house, so that anybody with any information could directly call the family instead of trying to get through to the police. Sounds like a great idea, right? Of course it wasn't. The family start to receive calls, some people thinking that they're being helpful, some very cryptic messages, and of course a lot of prank calls because people are just the worst. But some calls did raise some questions. The first unusual call came on June 25th from a man who called himself Pierluigi. He claimed that him and his girlfriend had seen a girl matching Emanuela's description playing the flute in the Campo del Fiore in Rome, and that she was going by the name of Barbara or Barbarella, and she was selling cosmetics. A few days later, another man who called himself Mario phoned the family with a very similar story. A girl who looked like Emanuela was calling herself Barbara and selling cosmetics in the company of another woman. It was mentioned by Mario that this girl had a flute, a detail about Emanuela that hadn't yet been included in the media, but apparently she refused to play it in public. She was also embarrassed apparently to wear the thick glasses she needed to play the flute, which did sound very much like Emanuela. Mario also said that Barbara had mentioned that she was going to play the flute at her sister's wedding in September, which was a very true but very random fact. She had apparently confided in him that she had run away from home, she needed some space, but intended to return home in time for the wedding. It's now believed that these men intentionally gave false information to steer the police investigation off. By the end of June, Rome was plastered with over 3,000 posters with Emanuela's photograph and information, asking the public for any tips at all. And agents from the SISDE, the Italian Secret Service, maybe SISDE, called on the Orlandi's home. Mario Volpiani and Giulio Ganghi turned up on the 24th of June, just before midnight. It turned out that Ganghi had actually met Emanuela before through her cousin Monica, although he did not make this clear to the Orlandis from the beginning. He seemed to be particularly invested in this case because of that reason. The agents took a look around Emanuela's room, including looking inside her diaries, and the Orlandis don't know if they took anything from her room or not. I suppose this shows just how seriously Italy was taking this case from the beginning. Almost immediately the Italian Secret Service are getting involved. They also attached a listening device to the family's phone to track the phone calls they were getting. Ganghi canvassed nearby garages looking for any information on green BMWs, and he actually found a mechanic who had fixed the passenger window of one that had been damaged from the inside. Could there have been a struggle inside this car? Could Emanuela have been in this car? The address linked to this car took him to an apartment 2 kilometres behind the Vatican. An angry woman answered the door and refused to answer any questions, practically chasing him off the property. His bosses weirdly order him never to return to this apartment, and not long after this, he's removed from the case and given a desk job. This is just a few days after Emanuela's disappearance. It seems like a really strong lead, a green BMW with a window that was broken from the inside, and the agent follows up, and then he very quickly gets demoted. On Sunday the 3rd of July, the investigation takes a turn when Pope John Paul II makes a public statement. Although no doubt he was trying to help with the investigation, it only made sense for the Pope to speak publicly about a missing person from inside Vatican City. This was pretty ill-advised. It was 11 days since Emanuela had disappeared, and so the Pope takes to St. Peter's Square for his weekly Sunday prayer before announcing that Emanuela had disappeared. He states, "I am close to the Orlandi family." Through doing this, he makes it personal. The Pope is emotionally invested in this story. And so the stakes are raised. He appeals to the sense of humanity of those responsible for this matter and calls for Emanuela's speedy return. From the beginning of this investigation, it was pretty clear to the police that this was a case of abduction, that somebody had taken Emanuela. And over the next 9 months, Pope John Paul II would make 7 more public appeals for Emanuela's release, which did help shift Italy's police into high gear with this. But after the Pope spoke with Emanuela, her case became global news. The whole world now knew that the Pope was invested in this case, and the kidnappers would have realised the true value of their hostage, if she was still alive by this point, and therefore people could use that. So 2 days after this, the Orlandi family received another strange phone call, this time from an anonymous stranger who would go on to be dubbed the American because of his accent. He told the family that they'd already been contacted by 2 members of his organisation, Pierluigi and Mario. The American said that Emanuela was a prisoner of their terrorist group, the ultra-nationalist Turkish Grey Wolves, and that they would be willing to free Emanuela in exchange for the release of Mehmet Ali Agca. He was a Turkish terrorist who had attempted to assassinate Pope John Paul II in 1981, and was subsequently arrested and held by Italy, serving a life sentence. The family later said this phone call, although it was terrifying, was a light at the end of the tunnel for them. Up until this point, they'd been living a nightmare, but this phone call, as concerning as it was, meant that Emanuela was alive and there was a chance they could get her back. That very same day, just a number of hours later, this same man calls the Vatican directly and suggests the same thing: trade Emanuela for Mehmet Ali Agca. Weirdly, Mehmet would publicly declare at this point that he didn't want to be released from Italian prison and said that he didn't know who this group were, although in a letter later published in 2006, he claimed that Emanuela was abducted as part of a plan to get him released from prison, and he claimed that she and another girl were whisked away to a royal palace in Liechtenstein. He was actually eventually released from prison in late 2010 and went on to do a television interview in early 2011. In that interview, he declared that the Vatican actually organised for him to attempt to assassinate the Pope, and that Emanuela was being kept as a prisoner by the Vatican before being sent to a Central European country to live as a nun. Apparently her family could go see her whenever they liked, she was just not allowed to leave the monastery. He's told a whole load of different stories over the years, so the moral of the story is you probably can't trust what a terrorist says. Over the coming months, there would be many more calls from the American. In one, he played a brief tape of a girl saying, "I'm Emanuela Orlandi and I attend a science high school." Although this recording sounded like her, the police couldn't take this as 100% proof that she was alive though. The man tried to back up his claims by leading agents to a photocopy of Emanuela's registration card for her music school, which they found in the chapel of Fiumicino Airport after an anonymous tip-off, and on September 4th they found a letter which contained photocopies of the sheet music she was studying at the time. Emanuela would have had both of these on her at the time she went missing. A later call produced a cassette tape with a recording. It sounded like a woman was being tortured, but police told the family it was simply a clip from a porn film. Authorities took this man very seriously, and this American had one big request. He wanted to be able to speak directly to the Vatican City's Secretary of State at the time, Cardinal Agostino Casaroli. And so that's what he was given. He was literally given a direct telephone line to the Secretary of State. But not much would come from this, and the content of these phone calls has never been made public. Of course, they attempted to track the phone calls from the American, but each one of the 16 phone calls was made from a different public telephone booth. On August 13th, this so-called terrorist group contacted ANSA, the Italian news agency, and demanded that the Pope must publicly declare by the end of August that Mehmet Ali Agca is a human being, just like Emanuela Orlandi. And so the Pope kind of obliged to this. He would take to his noonday prayer at Castel Gandolfo and said, "I feel very close to the parents of these young students, sharing their unspeakable anxiety, and I pray that the Lord will touch the hearts of those who say they are holding these innocent and defenceless beings. As always, I pray also for the person of my would-be assassin." It seems like the Catholic Church, like the police, were willing to follow compromising avenues to lead to the recovery of Emanuela. I mean, you've got the Pope here literally bending to the will of this apparently terrorist organisation. But by this point though, other organisations were clearly following the media coverage and started muddying the waters here, making their own claims of holding Emanuela. Things got complicated. A group called the Turkish Anti-Christian Liberation Front wrote 2 identical letters from Frankfurt demanding the release of Mehmet and his accomplices. This group made the suggestion that they were also responsible for the disappearance of Mirella Gregory, a young girl who'd gone missing in Rome just a month before Emanuela had. But her case hadn't quite reached the same level of attention. We'll talk about her again in just a second, bear with me. There was also a group called Phoenix and another called NOMLAC, the New Muslim Organisation for the Anti-Christian Battle, all of whom used Emanuela's case to publicise their causes. Things just got really complicated. Eventually, the American goes quiet. He was last heard from on October 27th, 1983, and things just stopped happening. Now, 15-year-old Mirella Gregory had left her house on the 7th of May 1983, after telling her mum she had a date with a former schoolmate. She was picked up by a man who Mirella's mother would later recognise when she saw him as part of the papal escort. This is a guy who worked for the Pope, and he picked up Mirella just before she disappeared. He was later identified, but as far as I can tell, not much more really happened here. Almost 37 years on, and just like Emanuela, Mirella has never been found, and it's thought that the two cases are almost certainly linked. But Mirella's story isn't the only one that is potentially linked here. Emanuela had a close friend named Raffaella Guggel, who in the months previously had complained of being followed. She was the daughter of Angelo Guggel, the Pope's personal butler. Shortly after the failed assassination attempt on the Pope by Mehmet Agca in 1981, Angelo heard rumours of a possible kidnap being planned and warned Raffaella, his daughter, to be careful and keep an eye out. And then she notices the same man following her on the bus to school on 6 separate occasions. Angelo was concerned and immediately transferred Raffaella to a different school, and she was no longer allowed to leave Vatican City alone. The Guggels lived in the same building as the Orlandis, and Emanuela and Raffaella looked pretty similar. Is it possible that once Raffaella was no longer available, the kidnappers just switched to another target, Emanuela? Emanuela's friends would later tell police that they'd seen men following Emanuela on 2 separate occasions, the last time being just 3 days before she disappeared. A car stopped as Emanuela and her friends were walking to the Vatican, and the man in the passenger seat reportedly pointed to Emanuela and said to the driver, "It's her." In April 1984, almost a year after the disappearance, an Italian newspaper ran a piece about Emanuela, featuring a photo of her stood next to John Paul II, with her friend Gabriella Giordani visible in the photo. The very same morning that photo was published in the paper, somebody rang the Giordani household, and the anonymous caller said, "Tell Gabriella that Emanuela is alive and well." Somebody had managed to see this photo in the newspaper and somehow, incredibly quickly, have been able to identify Gabriella in a world that's pre-social media. And for a lot of people, this likely meant that Emanuela was still alive and identified her friend herself, and one of her kidnappers called the Giordani household to wind them up a little bit. But I personally think it's probably more likely that it was somebody who already knew the family, who already knew Gabriella, who was just messing with them. And that was kind of it. Once the calls from the Americans stopped, the police were left at a dead end, with no idea if Emanuela was dead or alive. On Christmas Eve, John Paul II visited the Orlandi home, and Pietro, Emanuela's brother, recalls him saying that the kidnapping involved international terrorism. The Pope gave Pietro a job at the Vatican Bank, which he would go on to hold for many, many years. 3 days after this, the Pope goes to visit Mehmet Ali Agca in prison and forgives him. For many years, there was nothing more in this case, and in 1997, Italian prosecutors ended their investigation into Emanuela's disappearance, with a report that dismissed many of the conspiracy theories that were flying around. Although in recent years, it seems the case has kind of been renewed, and there have been many more steps forward in this case. There have been a number of theories thrown around about Emanuela's disappearance over the years, with links made obviously to terrorist organisations, to the Italian mafia, sex scandals within the Vatican, and even that Emanuela was abducted by the Vatican itself. Because it turns out the Vatican hasn't exactly been as helpful in this investigation as you would first think. They were actually less than willing to reveal all they knew about the kidnap. One priest who worked in the central office at the Vatican was overheard on a phone tap being urged by his boss to deny any knowledge of the Vatican investigation into Emanuela's case. And in 2012, a memo on Emanuela's case written by the Vatican's official spokesperson, Reverend Federico Lombardi, was stolen by the Pope's butler and made public. In this memo, he wrote, "If the non-collaboration with the Italian authorities was a normal and justifiable affirmation of Vatican sovereignty, or if in fact circumstances were withheld that might have helped clear something up, This is the Vatican spokesperson clearly questioning something here. And then around 2017, an Italian investigative journalist published a 5-page document that had apparently been written by a cardinal and held hidden in a locked Vatican cabinet for many years. This document suggested that the Pope had been involved in Emanuela's disappearance, and Pietro has said that he believes that Pope John Paul II knew exactly what had happened to Emanuela, but decided not to say anything in order to save the image of the Church. Catholicism. But the magistrates who conducted the investigation into the Pope's failed assassination attempt have said that Pope John Paul II was targeted because of his support with Solidarity, which was a dissident labour movement in Poland, his home country. Solidarity had destabilised the communists. At the later trial, it was argued that 3 Bulgarians had hired Mehmet Ali Agca on behalf of the Soviet KGB to kill the Pope. But when the assassination attempt didn't work, Emanuela was then taken by this group, the KGB, in order to blackmail the Pope into ending his Solidarity support. Later on, after the fall of the Soviet Union, one of the investigators on this case actually travelled to Berlin on behalf of the Orlandi family to interview a former member of East Germany's Stasi intelligence agency. This Stasi agent claimed that the letters that were apparently from the Turkish Grey Wolves, the people who said they'd taken Emanuela, were actually written by the Stasi. The goal was apparently to divert attention away from the Soviet spy agencies and place it on Islamist fanatics, and there were apparently several Stasi spies within the Vatican at the time. Although this doesn't answer the main question to me, did the Stasis actually take Emanuela then, or did they just see an opportunity to detract some attention away from them when she disappeared? And as for where Mehmet Ali Agca stands on all this, we've already clarified that even he doesn't know the answer to that. He can't seem to get any story straight whatsoever, saying it was the Soviets, then it was the Vatican. He said that he doesn't want to be released from prison, then he did, and then he would say it wasn't the Grey Wolves, then it was. Don't trust a terrorist. A lot of people believe now that the whole Mehmet angle anyway was a red herring, that too much time and focus was placed on this instead of actively trying to find Emanuela. Perhaps the real aim of all these calls from the American wasn't to get Mehmet Agca released from prison. The real aim was actually to get a direct line to the Cardinal at the Vatican, and we still don't know what was said in those calls to the Cardinal. It could have been anything. Another theory goes that Emanuela was actually killed within hours of her disappearance, which, as sad as that is probably the best outcome in this case. A quick death as opposed to the potential of months of captivity and torture by a terrorist organisation. I'd take the quick death any day. One journalist actually wrote a book which suggested that Emanuela was the victim of a satanic sex orgy organised by Vatican priests, who then went out of their way to distract the police with all of these phone calls. Honestly, I can't find any proof of this whatsoever though. This whole thing came from a statement from the official exorcist for the Diocese of Rome. It may well have been an inside job, but a satanic sex orgy is probably a leap. As an atheist, I have a difficult time believing anything that comes from the mouth of an exorcist, but if you're religious, you might have a different take on that, I don't know. As I said already, it's been noted that there may well have been Stasi spies within the government. An alleged spy and his wife were actually murdered within the Vatican walls in 1998. And it's suggested that the spies inside the Vatican may have organised Emanuela's abduction to force the Pope to embrace Ostpolitik, which was a rapprochement within the Soviet bloc. According to the definition here, a rapprochement is an establishment or resumption of harmonious relations. Basically, they wanted the Pope to become friends again with the Soviet countries. This is all pure speculation though, as are most theories mentioned in relation to this case. The truth is, the public will probably never know the inner workings of Vatican City, and the Vatican say that they have done everything they can to help with the investigation over the years. That top Vatican officials gave written statements to the police, allowed Sisti to tap the Orlandi family phone, and made the Vatican switchboard available for police to listen in to calls. Federico Lombardi, the one who wrote the questionable memo, later said that his memo was incomplete and misunderstood, and that he considered any suggestion the Vatican did not cooperate with the police as false and slanderous. There's even another unsubstantiated theory that suggested that Emanuela may have been having a relationship with an unnamed cardinal within the church, but again, there's nothing to back this up. But the last theory, and the one that most people consider to be the most plausible, is that of the Banda della Magliana, a well-connected criminal gang in Rome. This gang operated from the late 1970s to the early 1990s, and they had links to the mafia, politicians, and the intelligence services. They were in control of a lot of things that went on across Rome and Italy as a whole. For many years, they had money, and they invested the majority of the money in the mafia-connected Banco Ambrosiano. One of the main shareholders of this bank was the Vatican's Institute for the Works of Religion, or the IOR. But eventually, the bank crashed, and millions of pounds were lost. And the gang realised that the only way they could recoup their losses was probably through the Vatican, one of the main shareholders. This was known long before Emanuela's disappearance. The Vatican had been warned that they were likely to be targeted as a result of the bank crashing. And again, this sounds like the rest of the theories, just pure speculation, except there's actually potentially evidence to point to it being valid. One of the gang's leaders was a man called Enrico de Pedis. He had a former lover called Sabrina Minardi, who claimed to have seen Emanuela in the hands of the gang, and she had seen where they were keeping her. She even claimed to have eventually seen de Pedis disposing of Emanuela's body by dumping it in a cement mixer on a construction site in a seaside town just south of Rome. But Sabrina's memory was damaged from a lifetime of drug abuse, and her recollection of events was hazy at best. Other witnesses did come forward to back her up though, so she was taken quite seriously. And the traffic warden who had seen Emanuela talking to the man in a green BMW before her music lesson helped investigators work on a composite sketch of the man she was talking to. This drawing looked a lot like Enrico de Pedis. Investigators showed around 100 pictures to the friends who were with Emanuela when she was being followed, and all of the friends pointed to the same 3 men in the pictures, who were all involved in the gang, and one of them was Enrico de Pedis. Another gang member later came forward and said that he knew the kidnap of Emanuela was the work of the gang, who wanted to blackmail the Vatican into giving them their money back. De Pedis eventually died in 1990 after he was shot by rival gang members, and he was controversially buried in the Basilica of Sant Apollinaire, which is a very prestigious resting place, especially for a known gangster. And it's even crazier when you find out that burials hadn't occurred for over a century in this crypt. But apparently de Pedis was a benefactor of the basilica and generously helped the poor, so an exception was made for him. Suspicions about him were renewed in 2005 when an anonymous call was made to the Italian TV programme Chi ha visto, which translates to "Who saw you" in English. By the way, I'm well aware that I'm butchering the Italian pronunciation. There's no way I'm going to pronounce all this right at all. This anonymous caller said, "On the matter of Emanuela Orlandi, to find a solution to the case, go to see who is buried in the crypt of Sant Apollinaire Basilica, and about that favour that Redatino did for Cardinal Paletti at the time." Redatino was a nickname for de Pedis, and the basilica was attached to the building where Emanuela attended her music lessons. For years, the Orlandi family lobbied the Vatican to open de Pedis' tomb. I'm not exactly sure what they were hoping to find, probably Emanuela, but it was eventually opened in May 2012, and of course, only de Pedis' remains were inside. For more than a year, investigators conducted DNA tests on dozens of other skeletons found in this crypt that may have matched Emanuela's age, but of course, there was no match. She wasn't in there. And then in April 2013, a 58-year-old filmmaker named Marco Fusoni Assetti also contacted that same TV show. He led a reporter to a studio where he revealed a hidden flute. He said that this was the flute of Emanuela Orlandi, and her brother Pietro has agreed that it did look very similar. But tests on the flute couldn't find any of her DNA, even though it was 30 years later, and it remains unconfirmed if it is definitely hers. Assetti claimed that he took part in her abduction, that he was part of a group that feared that powerful Vatican right-wingers would use claims of Soviet involvement in the papal murder plot to cut Vatican ties with communist countries in Eastern Europe entirely. So the group decided on blackmail and contacted de Pedis and his gang with the law of getting his money back. They needed backup here. So it was basically this left-wing group contacted de Pedis' gang in order to work together to basically get what they wanted from the Pope. A Vatican citizen of the group apparently approached many girls in the city, trying to convince them to take part in this plan. Emanuela eventually agreed to take part and play hostage once she was told that her father was accused of links to the assassination attempt and was about to be fired. She thought that she could save her father's job by pretending to be a hostage. Assetti said that he was the one who made many of the calls to the Orlandi family and the Vatican, but 6 months after the abduction, he was actually jailed for accidentally running over and killing a young boy with his van. He spent a year in prison before spending another year under house arrest, and he said that he doesn't know what happened to Emanuela in that time. He says he came forward when he did because he was tired of living a lie, but he refused to name others who were involved in this. The police again took this really seriously and tried to compare the voice on the calls to Assetti's, but voices changed a lot in 30 years and the technologies used to record the calls didn't provide the best audio. The lead investigator said a lot of what he said is certainly nonsense, but we had to see in the middle of all this nonsense he also spoke some truth. He's certainly not someone who is just crazy. And then in October 2018, human remains were found during renovation work on the Pope's embassy to Italy in Rome. People immediately speculated that these were the remains of Emanuela, but even her own family said straight away they had no idea why the public would jump to that conclusion so quickly. Like, not everybody they find is going to be Emanuela. And of course, they weren't Emanuela. Test results released in February 2019 showed they were actually the remains of a Roman man who died between 190 and 230 AD, so a little bit too old to be Emanuela. The latest focus in the case has been on 2 tombs inside the Vatican walls, with authorities once again acting on a bizarre anonymous tip. You really can't say the police haven't done their job properly on this case. They have followed basically every lead they can, no matter how crazy it is. This tip basically said to search for Emanuela's remains under the statue of an angel pointing to a grave in the tiny Teutonic College cemetery in the Vatican walls. It really is a tiny cemetery tucked behind the walls of St. Peter's Basilica. It's usually used as a burial ground for the German-speaking members of Catholic institutions, and tourists are not allowed in there. Following this tip, the Orlandi family made a request to the Vatican to open this tomb, and amazingly, a state tribunal granted their request, which they said confirmed its willingness to seek the truth about the disappearance of Emanuela Orlandi. On July 11th last year, the first attempt was made to exhume the tombs, but the mystery just deepened when it was found that the bones of the 2 princesses who should have been in there were missing. A further search led to the discovery of a hidden ossuary, a container of bones, under this stone slab, which was opened on July 20th. Could these have been the bones of Emanuela? Of course not. The results of in-depth morphological analysis showed the remains dated back to the 1800s, so just another dead end here. And as for the princesses' bones, they may have been accidentally removed during structural work carried out in the college in the 60s and 70s. Pietro Orlandi still won't give up on finding out what happened to his sister. He solidly believes that she was taken because of her connections to Vatican City, because she was a citizen. Whoever took her targeted her because of this. As he said, she was a wedge in a system of blackmails, a system that included perhaps bits of the mafia, the Masons, the Vatican. He went on to say he doesn't believe that the Agca assassination connection is anything more than a means for someone to obtain a direct line to the Vatican, because that's not an easy thing to get. Although he's still suspicious of the Vatican, he sees it as a very good sign that they were so cooperative and willing to open up the tomb. As for what I think happened, I think the connection with the gang seems most likely. As I am an eternally positive, maybe naive person, I do tend to usually lean to an accidental death in cases where I can, that someone got lost and something bad happened. But I think we can all agree that that's very unlikely in this case. There's no doubt in my mind that somebody abducted Emanuela, likely to blackmail the Vatican. I would be really interested to hear recordings of the Americans' conversations with the Cardinal, but I doubt they were recorded in the first place, so we'll probably never know what was said. It is really strange that the content of these calls has never been released. There are rumours that Emanuela is now living in a convent or was assimilated into a Muslim society by the terrorist group. Maybe that's the case, maybe she's still alive, but I doubt it. As always, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this case in the comments down below, and I'll leave all my sources so you can go and have a further read if you so wish. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.